It's hard for people of the current generation to imagine that there used to be empty shelves in stores, and that to buy sausage or decent shoes you had to stand in a huge line. And yet, all of this happened relatively recently. Even our parents, who lived in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, knew very well what shortages were and how to get things. Yes, in the Soviet Union they produced an unimaginable amount of cast iron, built huge factories, and launched ships into space. But the communists still couldn't manage to feed people and provide them with enough goods of decent quality. The problem wasn't just the incompetence of the Kremlin's general secretaries and the communist nomenclatura, but also the simple unviability of the Soviet planned economy. However, that's not what our story is about today. As you know, nature abhors a vacuum. Therefore, if the Soviet state couldn't provide the population with consumer goods, there were always enterprising people who supplied everyone who wanted with the coveted scarce items. From the very first years of the Soviet Union's existence, the shadow business, speculation, underground production, and illegal trade flourished, and millions were made here. But Forbes never wrote about Soviet businessmen. In the state of workers and peasants, there were other articles for them, from the criminal code. In this episode, I will tell you how underground Soviet entrepreneurs lived, what they made their fortunes on, and how they spent their money. You will also learn how the Soviet authorities fought against the shadow business, what threatened speculators and underground manufacturers, and how effective these measures were. And of course, I will tell you about the most famous Soviet millionaires. My name is Semyon, and I declare the How Did They Live section open. Let's begin. Speculators and speculation. The main and most terrifying economic enemy of the Soviet state throughout its entire history was, without a doubt, the speculator. As early as July 22, 1918, Vladimir Lenin signed a decree called On Speculation, which effectively banned any private trade in the country. Later, there were temporary relaxations, for example, during the famous New Economic Policy period, but overall the communist policy remained the same, and the attitude toward entrepreneurship did not change. It was considered ideologically alien to Soviet society and was therefore ruthlessly persecuted. If we talk about the economic meaning of this term, speculation is making a profit from the difference between the purchase and sale prices of a product. Simply put, buy low, sell high, and pocket the profit. In essence, any private trade can be called speculation. In the Union, where all factories and stores were state-owned and the economy was planned, private entrepreneurship was considered a harmful remnant of the capitalist system. The state paid the population fixed salaries and pensions, provided housing, education and medical services, set fixed prices in stores, granted benefits. Everything was done exclusively in a centralized way and was strictly controlled. Naturally, against this background, any private initiative was out of place. On the other hand, the planned Soviet economy was so inflexible and inefficient that it simply could not meet the needs of the population. Constant planning errors, lack of motivation among workers and managers, and a complete absence of competition led to constant shortages of goods and their terrible quality. For the director of a shoe factory, the main thing was to fulfill the plan, and he wasn't particularly concerned about the comfort or appearance of the products. That's why it's not surprising that despite all the persecution and bans, speculation flourished in the Soviet Union, and almost everyone was involved in it. For example, an ordinary person, after standing in line all night and buying 2 pairs of Yugoslavian boots for 60 rubles each, would gladly sell one of them to a neighbor or colleague, but for 120 rubles. It might seem like a small thing, but you could get a hefty fine for it or even end up serving 2 years in prison. The real centers of speculation were the Soviet collective farm and cooperative markets. It was believed that only products grown by hand were sold there, but in reality, they served as outlets for selling stolen or illegal goods. Since shortages in the Soviet Union were widespread, all sorts of things became objects of speculation. For example, reselling books was a very profitable business because Soviet citizens really loved to read. There was an entire network for selling tickets to fashion shows and theaters. Spare parts for cars, household appliances, and building materials were in huge demand. If we talk about numbers, the most common items for speculation were clothing, 25% shoes, 15.6% alcoholic beverages, 9.4% agricultural products, 10.9% and car spare parts, 9.4%. The main role in such schemes was played by trade workers and enterprise managers. Goods were written off and instead of going to store shelves were sent to markets. Factories and plants produced counterfeit goods, which were then sold through markets or flea markets. Huge amounts of money circulated in this business, and illegal activities were often protected by local officials or law enforcement officers. By the 1970s, real trade had emerged in the USSR, a trade mafia that grew out of the socialist shortage. The authorities fought against speculators, but without much success, even though the measures taken against them were quite harsh. I already mentioned Lenin's decree against speculation. So, according to this document, the offender faced from 6 months of forced labor to 10 years in camps with confiscation of all property. In areas declared under martial law, speculators could even face execution. The state continued to fight speculation, though not with such draconian methods as in the early years of Soviet power. For example, under the 1960 Criminal Code, speculation was punishable by up to 2 years of imprisonment with or without confiscation of property, or by corrective labor for up to 1 year, or by a fine of up to 300 rubles, which was quite a large sum. For speculation on a large scale, they gave 7 years in labor camps with confiscation of property. Minor speculation was punished only administratively, and if committed again within a year, it resulted only in corrective labor for up to 1 year or a fine of up to 200 rubles with confiscation of the items involved in speculation. The only exception was speculation in foreign currency, for which they gave from 15 years of imprisonment up to the death penalty. The famous article of 1988 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation was finally abolished only in 1994. Fartsovka. The most unique type of Soviet speculation was undoubtedly Fartsovka. Fartsovka would buy or trade scarce imported goods from the few foreigners who came to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Everything was in demand. Clothing, shoes, accessories, cosmetics, music records, and even regular chewing gum, which once obtained was sold at a very high markup. It is believed that Fartsovka as a mass phenomenon was born during the World Festival of Youth and Students, which took place in Moscow in 1957. Fartsovka was usually done by students or citizens who, by the nature of their work, had contact with foreigners, guides, interpreters, taxi drivers, hotel workers. It is clear that Fartsovchiki were most active in Moscow, Leningrad, the capitals of the republics, and port cities, because foreigners rarely ended up in the Soviet hinterland. The terrible quality of domestic goods created a real cult of worship among Soviet citizens for foreign brands, or as they used to say back then, firma. It reached the point of absurdity. People decorated their cabinets with empty bottles or beer cans in their apartments, carefully washed and dried plastic bags, and children begged foreigners for chewing gum and candy. Levi's jeans would raise their owner's status to sky-high levels. It's no wonder that black market dealers thrived, even though this activity was extremely dangerous. All foreigners coming to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics were under KGB surveillance, so doing business with them was very risky. One of the main black market hotspots in the capital was Arbat. The Intourist, Cosmos, and Metropole hotels were also very popular. All these places were patrolled by police and state security officers. That's why the black marketeer's task was difficult: to blend in with the crowd, make contact with a foreigner, complete the deal, and slip away unnoticed with the goods. Imported goods were exchanged for various Soviet curiosities: badges, pioneer neckerchiefs, soldiers' belts and caps, painted boxes, antiques, matryoshka dolls, and of course, rabbit fur ear-flap hats. Black marketeers dressed in Western style and spoke their own slang. They called tourists from Finland Finniks, guests from the United States of America, Statniks, and Yugoslavs, Yugs. One of the keys to success for a black marketeer was knowing several foreign languages. Soviet entrepreneurs taught them right on the streets. Many well-known people were involved in black market trading in their youth, including actors Dmitry Nagiev and Alexei Gorbunov, the famous gallerist Dmitry Kankin, the poet Andrei Orlov, and the singer Nikolai Baskov. The painter Nika Safronov admitted that thanks to black market trading he bought his first apartment, but he almost ended up under KGB investigation. Today, former black market traders speak about their past occupation with a sense of nostalgia. It was like a closed elite club, being a member of which was both dangerous and profitable. They considered themselves hunters who were also being hunted. However, neither speculators nor, even more so, black market traders could solve the problem of the total Soviet shortage. A huge country needed completely different volumes of goods, and they were quickly provided. The task of supplying the population with scarce goods was taken over by the underground manufacturers. The essence of this phenomenon lies in the underground production of scarce goods, followed by their distribution through official and unofficial channels. First and foremost, the underground manufacturers focused on producing goods that could bring high profits in a short time. Most often, this was clothing or footwear. When talking about underground production in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, you shouldn't imagine some secret factories somewhere underground or hideouts in remote forests. It was completely different. Illegal goods were usually produced at regular state factories and plants, and often the workers themselves didn't even suspect it. Since it was impossible to legally obtain raw materials for private production in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, people resorted to various tricks. For example, they would overstate the need for raw materials, falsify records, save raw materials during the production of main goods, and write them off under made-up pretexts. The finished illegal products were sold through the black market or state stores. It should be said that Soviet underground entrepreneurs showed remarkable ingenuity and resourcefulness. There was nothing they wouldn't do and no schemes they wouldn't come up with. For example, in the 1960s, underground manufacturers started producing ordinary galoshes, which the Soviet industry was never able to produce in sufficient quantities. Galoshes were produced at state-owned rubber goods factories. The scheme was simple. Rubber intended for making things like hoses and gaskets was written off and used to make scarce galoshes, which were then sent to well-connected retail outlets. It might seem that galoshes are a small thing, but people made millions from them. Resourceful guys working at optical factories decided that the suede used to wrap lenses could be put to much better use. For example, to sew fashionable jackets or coats from it. The material was written off, for example, due to improper storage, and then it was cut accordingly and used to make clothing. In the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, there was a real fur mafia that supplied the population with fur coats, collars, and hats. And in the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, there were underground factories that produced fake Levi's and Wranglers on an absolutely industrial scale. There are hundreds of similar examples. Obviously, it was impossible to keep the existence of underground factories of such scale a secret. Too many people were involved in their activities, so the factory owners had to bribe a huge number of the right people. First and foremost, of course, law enforcement officers. The most successful entrepreneurs created real corruption networks that included not only ordinary police officers, but also employees of the Economic Crimes Department and local party officials. City and district committee secretaries, along with colonels and generals from the Ministry of Internal Affairs, were involved. This is how the Soviet state elite became corrupt, which played a significant role in the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. How did Soviet millionaires live? The life of Soviet entrepreneurs was not easy, and it wasn't just because of the constant threat of arrest, but also because their status was illegal. Yes, these were wealthy or even very wealthy people. But the problem was that they couldn't spend their money because the question about the source of their wealth would immediately arise. You couldn't deposit a significant amount into a savings account, buy several cars or apartments, or purchase luxury items. Many Soviet millionaires preferred not to stand out at all, leading deliberately modest lives and officially working in some insignificant position. Another headache for Soviet shadow businessmen were the gangsters, and we're not talking about some petty thieves, but serious criminal authorities. The criminal world quickly realized that the Chekhoviks was simply the perfect cash cow, easy and safe to deal with. After all, under any circumstances, the entrepreneurs couldn't turn to the authorities for help or protection. In 1979, a major thieves' gathering took place in Kislovodsk, where, in addition to criminal authorities, some of the most prominent Chekhoviks in the country were invited. As a result, the parties reached an agreement. The criminals promised the businessmen protection in exchange for 20% of the income from underground enterprises, which was sent to the thieves' common fund. Thus, the shadow Soviet business finally became a part of the country's criminal world. And now, a few stories about the most famous Soviet entrepreneurs. Mikhail Isaev was not an underground dealer or a workshop owner, but simply headed the supply department of the main bread authority during the harsh war years. However, in this position, he amassed such a fortune that he simply didn't know what to do with all the money. Isaev acted very simply. He took 1/10 of everything he supplied for himself, then sold it on the black market. By the end of the war, Isaev had become a multimillionaire. He threw wild parties, salted away money, bought up gold and jewelry, but he packed most of his stolen wealth into jars and buried them at his own dacha. However, half of the bills rotted in the ground. Eventually, law enforcement became interested in the official who was hoarding so much money and started an investigation. In the end, Isaev got 25 years in the camps for all his antics. One can only say that it wasn't enough. By the way, this story is instructive because it once again shows the main problem of Soviet millionaires. They had no way to spend their money. Isaac Zinger and Siegfried Gazen-Franz. These comrades opened an underground factory producing scarce knitwear in the capital of the Kyrgyz Soviet Socialist Republic in the city of Frunze, which is now Bishkek. They repaired decommissioned equipment, arranged for a workspace, and the work started to boom. The underground factory produced underwear, dresses, children's suits, fashionable sweaters, and cardigans. All of this was sold through friendly stores. After a few years, the Singer and Gazen-Franz factory was already bringing in 400,000 rubles in net profit. Gazen-Franz built a luxurious house, showered his wife with diamonds, and bought a Rolls-Royce from a foreign diplomat. Zinger, on the other hand, enjoyed himself at resorts, treating his mistresses to champagne baths. Interestingly, this sweet couple was protected by the head of the Republican State Planning Committee. Eventually, their lifestyle attracted the attention of the relevant authorities. Khrushchev was furious and ordered that the capitalists be dealt with to the fullest extent of the law. As a result, Zinger, Gazen-Franz, and 12 other defendants were executed, while 21 others were sentenced to 15 years in prison. Boris Roifman worked as the head of the workshops at a psychoneurological dispensary right in the center of the capital. Here, this enterprising comrade set up an underground sewing operation using the free labor of unfortunate patients. Roifman's accomplice was a certain Shakerman who was responsible for selling the finished products. The enterprise brought in enormous profits. During the 1961 currency reform alone, Roifman and Shakerman exchanged 1 million rubles for new bills. The profitable business was exposed because of a woman. Shakerman started an affair with a married woman whose husband reported them to the KGB. During a search of the factory owner's apartment, they found gold, jewelry, and stacks of money. As a result, Roifman and Shakerman were brought to trial, where they were sentenced to the highest penalty. The case of Roifman and Shakerman even became the basis for a feature film. It was called Black Business. The king of speculation, Yan Rokotov. Yan Rokotov can be called a man with a difficult fate. By the age of 20, he had already been convicted under the infamous Article 58 and sent to the camps. After Stalin's death, he was rehabilitated and even reinstated at the institute. But he didn't want to continue his studies. Instead of studying, Rokotov threw himself into business. Naturally, it was illegal. Together with several friends, he created a complex scheme for buying up foreign currency and scarce goods from foreigners. His main workplace became Gorky Street, from Pushkin Square to the National Hotel. Rokotov's business was going so well that soon he was eating at the Aragvi restaurant and getting around the city exclusively by taxi, changing lovers like gloves. As for the turnover, when Rokotov was arrested, they confiscated a suitcase from him containing valuables and currency worth $1.5 million. And this was in 1960 in the Soviet Union. At first, the court sentenced the black market dealer to 8 years in prison, but after Khrushchev personally intervened, the sentence was reviewed and Rokotov was executed by firing squad. The case caused a huge public outcry, not only in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics but also in the West. Yuri Sokolov is the main speculator in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Khrushchev era was not only known for the famous thaw, but also for a period of strict tightening in the economic sphere. Khrushchev fiercely hated speculators and was determined to defeat the black market. In 1961, at his initiative, the death penalty was even introduced for economic crimes. The Khrushchev era became a golden time for Soviet black marketeers and underground factory owners. The next serious crackdown on shadow businessmen was carried out by Yuri Andropov, who came from the state security agencies. He decided to start the cleanup with the fattest target, the Yeliseyevsky grocery store, located in the very center of Moscow. In fact, this was the #1 store in the country. It supplied scarce goods to the Soviet elite, and there were indeed serious violations at Yeliseyevsky. However, just like in most other Soviet stores, Sokolov was simply unlucky. They decided to make him a scapegoat, especially since his patron was considered to be the master of Moscow, Viktor Grishin, the main enemy of Andropov. Sokolov was allegedly promised his life in exchange for cooperating with the investigation, and so he started talking. Based on his testimony, hundreds of criminal cases were opened against employees of Moscow's trade sector. Sokolov himself was executed at the end of 1984. He died shortly before the arrival of the new General Secretary in the Kremlin, Mikhail Gorbachev, who started perestroika and allowed private entrepreneurial activity in the country. However, that did not save the Soviet Union. Instead of an epilogue, the topic of Soviet underground manufacturers and speculators still sparks heated debates among historians and ordinary people alike. For my part, I can say the following. The Soviet government created the most terrible thing it possibly could. It destroyed people's drive for development, their drive for entrepreneurship. In the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, tens of thousands of intelligent people who wanted and were able to create businesses and develop the economy were destroyed. For example, people like Ziga and Gazanfrance. But at the same time, in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, they allowed people to steal, like Mikhail Isaev, making theft almost normal, didn't they? Which, of course, is very, very bad. So bad that a huge number of people won't even understand why. That's all I have. See you in the next episode. Bye.